Perfect.
All right. Thank you everyone for coming today, and very happy to see everyone here in Brussels. We're going to be having a talk with Marlene Bart, who's come from Berlin. And Marlene is an artist we've been working with for 3.5 years since we opened our gallery, and who actually was in our very first exhibition. And this exhibition here, Boundary Objects, is an extension of your show Ordnungswut that you did in Vienna about 8 months ago. And so we're very excited to bring it here. Marlene is an incredibly talented artist who works across media, works in digital media, glass, graphics works, and other things. I'll let you explain more about that as we continue the conversation. Marlene also is Dr. Marlene Bart, and recently finished her PhD at the Bauhaus Universität in Weimar, Germany, and has many other accomplishments. Lives in Berlin, and anything else we should add to that?
No, that's fine.
Okay, well, then we'll go ahead and start with the conversation then. All right. So I kind of want to open with kind of some personal conceptual foundations of this exhibition. And I wanted to ask you about your practice, which often explores boundaries and systems of orders, and order and disassociation in ordering systems. And what has drawn you to ordering systems? What has drawn you to these concepts?
I mean, I guess when you're talking about order, or if we are talking about order, it's quite an abstract concept. So we know we are tidying up our rooms, our apartments. It's something that we feel we have to do. So Ordnung or order is somehow part of all our lives. But when I was also reflecting about my practice, I realized that this kind of search for order or fascination for order really also started with maybe even a bit childish fascination for things that are ordered. For example, in natural history museums or in libraries, because maybe also some of you know this feeling entering one of these majestic spaces, and then you see all the specimens or all the books, and it somehow has this authority, but it's also really makes you really feel very curious. Even though people have discovered all of these things already, you could maybe go in there and discover it all for yourself in a very different way. So I felt always that also in for example, one book itself, an encyclopedia, for example, if I would look at this type of book, it would basically be the same feeling, entering a whole space. So I could really I felt pull into these tableaus or different arrangement of images, for example, in encyclopedias. So I thought, okay, I don't really know why I'm curious, but I am. So this impulse, this fascination, I think that was really the starting point. And then I started collecting, because collecting things is always part of every order, or the beginning point for every order, but collecting is not automatically ordering. But the order emerges somehow from the collection. So I started my practice very much with collecting images in encyclopedias. So there are a lot of scholars who wrote, for example, about encyclopedic writing. So how does these types of writing and descriptions have changed over centuries? But there's not so much research on the visual part of it, because the visual elements in encyclopedias have always been seen more as some type of decoration. But I thought there must be more about it, because I always felt there is knowledge inside of these images. So this was really the starting point of working around order, I would say. And then I started this own collection of encyclopedia images. But when you collect a lot, then at some point questions emerge, how to order all these images, and why do I collect, for example, an image of a dog, and why do I collect images of frogs 10 times, or why are there even so many images of frogs or frogs being dissected? So all these questions emerge, and then you have to think about taxonomies, and maybe there is already an order implemented in the material I was using, and then I was also wondering, are these orders right? So first, it was like a huge phase of my practice, which is based on fascination, kind of like a childish or naive and very intuitive curiosity. But then I also, through that, that led me to more critical questions about ordering systems. Yeah, so maybe this is the first.
Well, and it sounds like it's this unfolding process, and once you start collecting, it starts moving forward. And I'm thinking of Denis Diderot in the 18th century when he went ahead and started the encyclopedia, and this idea of capturing all of human knowledge in a series of books. And then, of course, that's an unfolding thing, because as soon as you start capturing, the more you start capturing, the more you realize there is to capture, and it becomes a process without limit. And at the same time, but then you're also breaking into ordering systems too, which is so much also part of your practice.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think I really I approached order through construction, because my mother, for example, is also an architect. So I always, when I was a little girl, I saw her constructing things. And I think architecture, for example, has still a big impact on my work. So you see all these different modules and elements that reappear. And this act of construction is something human-made, it's something artificial. But I think you can also apply it to ordering systems. But a lot of natural philosophers have said there is something like an order of beings or an order of things, like if this was a natural given order. And what I'm also criticizing is that we are still, even though there's so much critical literature out there, we go into situations in collections, in museums, and we feel like, okay, yeah, this is now ordered in the right way, or this order makes sense, but there's not such thing as an order that really makes sense. But for a long time, this was a big part of, kind of philosophical history, to develop these systems, and also of natural history, to kind of look at nature and, for example, decide, oh yeah, humans have so many abilities, as Aristotle, for example, wrote, but a stone has not so many abilities, so it is on a lower level, for example. Yeah, and even though these theories are very old, they are still inherent in our society, and I think especially also from now I'm coming to the deconstruction, also from a feminist point of view, it's important to break up these systems.
But which brings me to kind of the title of the exhibition. The title of the exhibition is Boundary Objects. And boundary objects is coming from this theorist, Susan Leigh Starr, who wrote about museums and this idea of objects being, how could we put it? It would be objects that are both there, but then they're held, there's multiple meanings to different parties to these objects. At the same time, these objects, because there's multiple meanings and there's overlapping meanings, they become moments where people can collectively get together and also meet around those objects and have that. And how does that relate to your work here? Yeah.
I mean, Leigh Starr's concept is super fascinating, so if you haven't heard about her work yet, I can highly recommend to have a look into that. The boundary object concept, I think, is extremely fascinating from an artistic point of view, also because it is so hard to grasp, and there are a lot of scholars who are trying to explain what she meant exactly with these orders or with these boundary objects. But I think the point of what she does is also that it's very ambivalent. So you can't say exactly this one thing is a boundary object, and also boundary objects can change, they can learn, like an actual physical object can be a boundary object, but also a technology can be a boundary object. But when I first read her work, she's referring to a lot of research that she did in natural history museums, and she talks about taxidermy. And I also, when you look at the works, you can probably easily tell there is a big inspiration from natural history elements and taxidermy as well. And I also work with taxidermists, and for my PhD I also researched a lot in the Natural History Museum in Berlin. And I feel very connected to what she describes, because when you enter an institution like a natural history museum, you realize these institutions are so huge. And there's not like one collection manager, there are sometimes hundreds, and there are curators and taxidermists, so many different people. And for example, the object, the taxidermy, can mean so many different things for all of these people. So it makes a complete difference if I would talk to the taxidermist who made the taxidermy about the object, and then maybe I go to the curator of the exhibition and they would say something different again. So I imagine this concept of Leigh Starmore, that you have like this boundary object, and from that object you can imagine maybe some kind of net, or maybe even tentacles. So there is also some, I would say, this is maybe a little bit related, at least for me, to Donna Haraway's concept of tentacular thinkings. And I think this is also why this boundary object concept is so appealing for artists, because what we do is try through our work to express different and non-conventional ways of thinking and understanding and looking at things. So I'm not sure actually if my works are boundary objects, but I feel like how I look at the world, this is like very much influenced by this theory. And I like also the idea, how could be an object, as one of my sculptures, be a boundary object?
I mean, I really love this idea. And when we were talking about the exhibition, we were talking about the different points of that. And Marlene was both showing me this new work here, the unknown femur, as well as talking about these objects, and talking about Susan Leigh Starr's work, and this idea of, I looked at that and I thought, well, is that a boundary object? Is that because it's such a departure in your work? And I think sometimes we can look at departures in history. We can look at departures, and we can look at something in the history of art. Say we can look at Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avignon as this piece done in 1907 with these incredible things that was just so very new. Or Marcel Duchamp with his urinal in 1913 coming there, and this being an object that there was art history beforehand and there's art history afterwards. But I think also, Marlene, you were kind of expressing to me that there could also be, within an individual artist career, within an individual artist's oeuvre, there could be an object like that shifts the boundary of their work.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, also what she also includes in this theory and concept of boundary objects is the social context. So this work, since it's so new, it hasn't seen so many different contexts. So it has just been in gallery spaces so far. So maybe it would be really interesting to talk about it. And this is also a big part of my artistic work in general, to talk to researchers from different areas. So I would love to talk for example, with someone who studied medicine about this, or someone who works in a natural history museum, or someone who comes from a completely different field. And I think then it would also become more a boundary object. So maybe this is also an ongoing process. Maybe an object itself is never a boundary object from the start. It has to be, it's always connected to context. It can't just be seen as a singularity.
Well, and if a work of art can hold both ideas and also hold its own materiality to it, I think we've started with the ideas around it, but I think we can also start moving to the actual materiality of the work.
Yeah.
And maybe we can talk about this piece to begin with. Just what is it? What's happening here?
I mean, you tell me.
Well, I'd be happy to you do that. But yes.
I mean, I find it like sometimes a bit pointless to describe, like, I mean, I know what the materials are, and yeah. I mean, if there's a big, if you feel it's like quite a big mystery to you what the materials you're seeing here are, then I can tell you what it is. But so the starting point for the sculpture was thinking actually about earlier works, and I did a lot of installation. For example, the Ordnungswut installation in Ordnungswut, yes, is German and means something like the anger that you feel when you're ordering things. Like you can imagine ordering your room and you get like really angry about it because maybe you were really like it gets really good, but then you can't stop. Maybe then you want to order your pencils, or you feel like somehow I'm struggling with this ordering process. Maybe it's also something very German. I think we talked about.
We'll leave that one aside.
So maybe some cultures have more Ordnungswut than others, but then of course I also I'm very interested in feminist theory and the deconstruction of systems that are still a big part of our society. So the aspect of dissolution became more important for me recently. And also at the same time I see these constructions that I'm creating, I don't see them as just as modules or as architecture, but also as skeletons. So they have somehow a natural way of constructing themselves, but at the same time they can change. But I see them as something organic, and I also I enjoy kind of like putting them into order, but I also enjoy de-installing them, for example. And I thought about this process and these feelings that are connected to that, and how these modules and architectures are also as how I see them as skeletons. And I'm also lucky enough to have a lot of bones, basically. So I'm collecting bones. So the collecting didn't stop with the images, but also continued with objects. So I acquired that femur bone, and I loved it immediately because I couldn't really tell from which species it was. And then I posted a photo of this bone on social media and asked people to maybe guess what it is. And we don't really know yet. Some said it's a human. But it isn't. So I'm pretty sure it's an animal femur bone. Some said it might be a deer. So that might be something. It could be from a deer, but I'm still not 100% sure. So even some biologists couldn't really tell me from which animal it is. But it's I like that some people thought it's human. So the size is actually very similar to human femur bone, and it also symbolizes stability somehow. Bones in general, but especially this type of bone. But it also has different meanings in, for example, the history of paleontology, because when paleontologists found dinosaur bones, quite often they photographed themselves next to the femur bone, for example, of a brachiosaurus. So they would like lie onto the earth, like next to the bone, and look how big this dinosaur is. And also at the femur bone, you can kind of guess how big the animal was that you might find, or even if you don't find the whole animal, you can make suggestions about that. So I like these different meanings of this pure bone, and then of course also their space odyssey. I'm not actually 100% sure if this is a femur bone too, but this bone, like it's super straight. You kind of think about that as well. And I thought about how would it feel like if this bone is dissolving? And I also saw the movie Annihilation, where researchers go into some kind of different sphere. So there's some kind of like shimmer, and maybe you know that movie. They go into it, and they see really weird things happening. They watch some kind of dissolution of animal molecular structures and human molecular structures. So there are maybe new species, or definitely like weird things that they meet there, and also kind of like humans and plants become one. So I thought, how would it be to work with glass, like kind of visualizing that idea of dissolution or reconfiguration. So this is how I decided to bring glass as a medium in it. And then this is like this. So now I'm actually end up explaining what the materials are.
Thank you.
The other structures, like it's 3D printed, and it's inspired by the molecular structure of human bones. Yeah.
And so you're looking at bones as both the physical bones, but also in some of the things as exoskeletons, as internal skeletons, and the modules themselves as a sort of exoskeleton that actually contains the objects within them in this exhibition. Correct?
Yeah.
And what about the printmaking work? How does that relate to this sense of the encyclopedia, the sense of the bones, the sense of the glass work?
I mean, printmaking is really like, it's super important for me because really the starting point of my practice. So I studied painting, but then got very quickly inspired by printmaking, like screen printing, etching, all kinds of printing. Also cyanotype, for example, which is not directly like printing, but these type of like two-dimensional techniques. I think also on a practical level, I just really liked to do it and still like to do it. But there was, of course, like a strong correlation. Like you mentioned Diderot before, like these like old encyclopedias with these copper plates printed, and I also developed a lot of like printmaking works, which are like imaginary sides of an encyclopedia that has never existed, or that is basically also like an artist book. And also through the printmaking works are very often also research inspired. So I go to places, for example, into collections or into research institutions, and I talk to people. I also did the same thing with taxidermists in the Natural History Museum, and there we actually did some kind of exchange because I really wanted to learn taxidermy myself. So we made an agreement, so they would teach me some taxidermy and they would get a print. Which was then based on the research I did there. So it's also some kind of communication medium, I guess.
But isn't that where your work really lies, at the intersection of art and science in many ways? Yeah. And it's interesting that because you have this deep love of the sciences, but in specifically natural history and biology, but then you chose to study art and to use that as a way, as a research principle there. And what was it about art? Was it the imaginative qualities? What was it why did you choose to go into the arts to investigate the sciences and not the sciences directly?
Not the other way around.
Or the sciences directly, yes, yeah.
I felt I had basically no choice. So like kind of like becoming an artist was a bit like, how do you say, like Vorbestimmung. So it was kind of like it was not really like just a conscious decision. It was just like what I always did, what I had to do. Also, I felt I didn't have like my, for example, like biology teachers or like physics teachers were not really the greatest. So I didn't found out that early that all these things are connected that much. I think maybe I would have went into a more kind of scientific direction from earlier on, or maybe studied biology next to art if I would have understood all these or if I would have seen that earlier. But I'm still thankful that I had all this time just like understanding or like spending so much time with my practice in the beginning of my studies.
I mean, I think it's a really important thing. I mean, one of the things that I believe in with our gallery and the artists that we want to show is that I think that our art itself is its own means of research and knowledge production. And it has just as much value as scientific inquiry. It has just as much value as technical inquiries. And in many ways, it has both the iterative work that you have in the sciences or technical things where you build upon one idea, builds upon the next idea. But then you also have that. You also have the art allows these imaginative leaps where you could suddenly imagine something different, and that opens up all kinds of possibilities. And even the scientists I know will sometimes say a lot of the greatest scientific discoveries have been made through those imaginative leaps, in many ways in touch with the arts.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it's also, you see it a lot like art-science collaborations, and a lot of like also big institutions in the natural science field which open up for like artists in residence programs and all of that. But at the same time, I think artistic practice is not automatically artistic research, and it doesn't have to be. I mean, I think it can, and it quite often is, without calling it itself that. But it doesn't have to. What the amazing thing about art itself, it's not serving any purpose. You know, it's not like design. You don't have to be able to use it for a certain purpose afterwards. That art can be so fluid and abstract and all of these things. On the other hand, I think artistic research has a couple of like different layers to it, and it needs more kind of like the kind of like openness to really dive into a different field. So it's kind of like if you can of course work as an artist with, let's say, a biologist, if you don't know anything about biology, but it's much easier if you're willing to learn about it, and if you're interested and maybe have this like childish intuition to dive into something. I think this is also a big quality that scientists see quite often in artists and why they enjoy these type of collaborations. But I think it can also become a problem if, what I've seen a lot, that there's also sometimes a very old-fashioned attitude from artists, and they would say things like, yeah, but I don't talk about what I'm doing here. I'm not explaining anything. It's not me to do that. I get in an art historian to do it for me. And fair enough, but I think if you want to work at this intersection, which can be, at least like for me, very inspiring, you have to also make the effort to look through different lenses somehow.
I mean, I think it's really important. I mean, one of the things I've discovered over the decades of working with artists is that artists come from all walks of life, and there's so many ways to come into something that we call art. And there's no one way, there's no one path, and there's so many different types. People who are very solitary, people who work collaboratively, people who they want someone to discover what the meaning of their work is, people who are then trying to, give meaning through their work, give a message through their work. It can be so many different ways. So I think that's very exciting. I wanted to turn to something else. Just in the work itself, one of the things that I see with Marlene's work is that she's often working with these ideas of fragility and strength. And this glass is both fragile and yet strong. And what does that mean to you? That's come up in a lot of the literature around your work.
Yeah, but it's also, the first time when I had the chance to work with glass, I was basically just amazed by the process, how it's being made. And a lot of the works are not kind of like blown in the classical sense, but more like formed with metal tools. So it's really like a sculptural process. And then, of course, there is this magic of this hot glass, and then it becomes solid. So going through these like different stages, but then when you work, you can work with glass in different processes, but if you do it in this kind of like blowing glass forming process, it's happening also quickly. So it's almost like you can't almost follow. And so it has just like this is just all that itself is extremely fascinating. When I work with glass, also the very first time I had the chance to work with glass blowers in Murano, and they never work alone. There are always like two of them, and there's a maestro sitting using the tools, and then there's another one helping, like bringing the material. And sometimes they get in very tender positions, or very like kind of like tight positions, so they get very, very close to each other. So it reminded me also a little bit of Ghost and the pottery scene, when Patrick
yes. So it's a choreographed dance almost.
Absolutely, and also it was at the same time there were like these big guys with tattoos and all of that, but then there was this like tenderness to the production, within the production process, and it was really amazing to watch that. So I think the material itself, but also the production process, has all these many different layers. And I guess I'm still fascinated by it, and at the same time, once it's hard, it's one of the most sustainable materials you can use. So I think these objects, they wouldn't work with resin, for example. They would not have expressed the same magic, and also how the glass interacts with light. There's all these like different elements. So I don't want to give like a very like theoretical response to that, because this I think this fascination for the material is something that is also a big part of it, and also why the work is corresponding.
When you were talking about the choreography of the glass blowers, these male figures moving together in this kind of dance, it brought me right away to this piece. There's stag beetles, and you've talked to me about how these stag beetles are related to queer ecology, and this idea of these are both male beetles in a mating dance.
I mean, yeah, queer ecology is a big part of, or a big interest of mine because, as I mentioned before, quite often nature is used, or animals are used by humans to justify certain concepts that we have in our society. But these concepts are very much constructed, and quite often there's a patriarchal influence into them. And there are actually also people in biology who claimed, yeah, this is like because animals do that and that, it's the same for humans, or there is like, it's always like a binary concept of genders. But if you really look into nature, and also all the biologists I know, they would never describe it like this because there's so much variation, and also sex for different reasons. It's not just about reproduction. And yeah, I'm especially fascinated by snails because they are hermaphrodites, for example, but they're like endless, like different scenarios. And yeah, the stag beetles, this was, it was just inspired by their kind of like fighting. But then they end up maybe in a bit of like kind of like not so clear position, and also of course it's like this mirroring of basically of these like two beautiful objects and the symmetry of the beetles itself.
Fabulous. And I also, when it comes to your brain here, the Psychographics Reloaded, one of the things you talked to me about this piece is the challenge of doing this piece where you had to create glass and then put it into other hot glass. And do you want to talk about that challenge of that and how it works and how it...
Yeah, I mean, it's...
and the end effect of it, I guess.
Yeah, you can see it here, but also in some other pieces where we experimented with this. So there is an earlier sculpture that I did, which is a resin sculpture, like a cast of a brain model, and there are actual wasps inside of it. So I bring this piece with me to Murano, and this was actually the very first piece that we did there. And yeah, I asked, like, can we do something like that? Can we use the sculpture as a starting point? So there are actual bees inside, even though you might not recognize them now, and all the bees had to be created first as individual objects, and then be held warm, and then they were basically like pushed into this glass brain. So that's like the technical side of it. But I also really like now in the end that you can't really recognize them anymore, just like a little bit like of the colors. But there's a whole like psychographic object series, and it's always this idea of insects getting somehow like into, like approaching the human brain, maybe kind of like building something in there. Also in the virtual reality work that I did, Theatrum Radix, the first chapter, you're basically diving into this exact sculpture, and it opens up and breaks, and then you are in some surreal beehive with different like neural structures, and the bees are creating a completely new architecture inside of it. So they're claiming back the space in a way. So this is always related to this psychographic work series.
And I guess there's the point of ecology of claiming back space, right? Claiming back meaning in ecology, would you say?
Yeah, but also, I mean, I find like humans an incredibly fascinating species, but we're also very arrogant somehow. So we are also thinking quite often that we are so smart and more intelligent maybe than other species. And I just like the idea of the complex structures of, for example, like especially like bees, but also other insects. And then you look into this brain sculpture, but what you find in there is not really human. So also giving some credit of these type of structures, and really like changing this anthropocentric view that we often have on things. And I know it's very difficult, maybe impossible. But I think it's important to try.
And one of the things also that I see in your work, there's a sense of play in your work. Where does play come in? Because there's these structures that are structured, and yet there's this sense of play. There's a sense of I don't want to say humor, and there's not humor, but there's a sense of playfulness. Playfulness, I would say also, and perhaps humor in some pieces. Yeah, and I mean irony too. I mean, I'm aware that the dinosaurs over there, that they make people smile, of course, and also I think it's important because this starting point that I described initially, like that I was just so fascinated by things.
when I refer to things like that, I'm not just referring to my individual experience, but experiences that we've all made. We've all been out in the nature as children, or in different situations where we started collecting something that was really fascinating to us, and we did it maybe without knowing why. And I feel quite often this this intuitive approach that children have is something that a lot of artists share in a very positive way, and sometimes we lose that during our lives because society is tough. But it's great to keep it, and I think this is also why artworks resonate with so many people so strongly, because they can feel that playfulness. And I think it's also important that it's not too serious. If I wanted to be like really serious, I can write the driest scientific text. But maybe I also put a little bit of playfulness into that, I don't know. But yeah, I think it's this ambivalence that makes things strong and meaningful.
Oh, I love that because, over my years of working with collectors, you see people come to work for a variety of reasons. They come to work because of what they think their rational brain wants, whether it's the value of the artist or the intellectual ideas behind it. But what's often appealing to them is something else deeper, some other childlike sense in them that just grabs them, and they feel attracted to this work and they don't know why. And this part I enjoy very much.
Yeah, it's important because our world is way too rational. There are things that we can't rationalize, and I think this is also, again, like back to Susan Leigh's Star, why this concept has been picked up so many times, because she gives us a little bit like of the idea that there is something like a structure. So it is a concept, it has been written down in a text, but at the same time there's so much freedom within that, and then we can like work around that. So it gives us structure, but at the same time it allows us access to different things, maybe even to something metaphysical. And I guess in these times we maybe need that. We need to be like tricked a little bit into more unconventional thinking to actually create something new.
It's interesting, sometimes contemporary art can be challenging for many different people, and yet when we're in a world where there's so much political upheaval and so many things going on, and what we've gone through from economic challenges, the pandemic, to the recent wars, I think people are suddenly realize that art can also be a safe space where these ideas can be played out and can be experimented in, and don't have the serious real world consequences of the real world.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about the exhibition as a whole, and specifically to the Ordnungswut Tower, if you can speak about that as a conceptual idea. We show that first in Vienna, and then it has been shown in Berlin since then, and now it's here in Brussels. Tell me about what the tower represents as a sense of ideas.
I mean, the modules that you see here, but that are also part of the tower, in total there are 49 modules, and I created those originally for an installation in a theater space, and there were not only artworks inside, but also specimens from the Natural History Museum in Berlin. And when this exhibition was over, one step back, so the number 49 was inspired by Giulio Camillo, who is an Italian philosopher, and he created a theater of memory. And this memory theater had 49 elements. So I liked this idea of the memory theater. This is why I created then 49 modules. And after this exhibition ended, I thought a lot about, okay, what different type of form could my skeleton take, and then we were talking about the show in Vienna, and I started just like basically like a child with like, how do you say, like these different like with different modules, like playing around in the studio, putting them together. I thought what might work, and then I came to this tower constellation, and I thought that's interesting because it's a bit like the Tower of Babel, and in Vienna there's also the painting of the
Bruegel from this part of the world actually, but yes, it lives in Vienna.
Yeah, and what you don't see so much in this show, but what is a big part of my work, is the work with new technologies. So I work with virtual reality and augmented reality. So of course I'm also somehow involved in this big discussion about artificial intelligence, and what everyone knows so far are these, or is using already, are these large language models. And I like this connection of this confusion of language of the Tower of Babel, and that can come out of, for example, ChatGPT. I mean, there have been also all these like great articles about how ChatGPT is, or AI is hallucinating. Maybe you also experienced it once. Hallucinating is quite interesting what it can come up with, and when it gets into this state. So I thought it's interesting, and then also this aspect of like trying to create order, but there never is something as a complete ordering system. So the elements in the tower, they don't follow like a strict system, but the idea is more that when you surround the tower as a viewer, you can build your own network. For example, you can look for the materials, you can look at, what's glass in here, what is 3D printed, or there's a frog, there's something like a toad, and there's a spider, are these species connected? And kind of like spending some time with it, but creating like inherent and visible networks which are all individual. And then there's also this light element in the tower, because when we created it for the space in Vienna, I also had this idea that this tower becomes some kind of lung, so that it would be some kind of like breathing tool for the exhibition space. It still has the same function in here, but this is why the lighting element in the middle looks the way it does. So it was also, I was a bit inspired by like how you call it, like iron lungs.
So this biological element too, this living element too.
But more something which is not from this planet anymore, something that would be maybe more in an artificial environment, like some kind of spaceship. So I got a bit wild with that.
And since you have done the virtual reality work, which we've shown before, which is not in this exhibition, but it's quite wonderful, and you're working also with electronic arts, where is your work going next on this? Do you have anything you want to release to the public, or is it still in this in-between world?
No, it can be. I mean, at least I can talk about it.
Okay.
So there's a new work in the second development phase at the moment. It's called Patterns of Pathology, and it's going to be an augmented reality work. It started as a collaboration between the Max Planck Society, and they matchmaked artists with scientists. So I was matchmaked with a scientist, historian from the Maastricht University, Flora Leeson, and she's amazing. She writes, for example, about the history of brain visualization. She wrote some amazing text, for example, about how people I think it was maybe in the 60s, but not 100% sure, how they tried to send or somehow visualize brain waves through the radio completely. I mean,
this sounds like the 1960s.
And she's working on subjects like this, and she wrote a great book, Brain Media. And we started talking to each other, trying to find common interests. So we were both interested in systems, pattern recognition, artificial intelligence, but also the interpretation of EEG data. And since I love to use historical reference points, we found this historical EEG atlas from the 1940s, which is done by Frederick and Erna Gibbs, a couple that lived in the US. And they did, at that time, one of the biggest recording of brain data. So you have this big atlas with these like scribblery lines. And then I thought about, but with what material to work with? Because it was clear Flora would write a text for an edited volume, and I would create an artistic work. So I decided, if she's writing the whole historical analysis of this subject, I can be a bit more playful here too. So I decided to work with data sets that were from women from that atlas, which were in the same age span between as Flora and I, so between 30 and 40 years old, and kind of picking these data not just based on this rough frame, but not looking at if they were maybe diagnosed as schizophrenic, epileptic,
yeah.
or something else, because we know at that time the diagnoses were quite often very questionable, and especially they're also big
with
gender
women,
health
yeah.
and so on. And I also thought it would be interesting, like through an artwork, through animations, bring back some life into that data, because obviously these data sets are not really representative for these women. So what's happening in the augmented reality work is that the user can interact with these different data sets, but they will never know with what data set they're interacting. So the data sets are used for animations, for example, like a figure riding or some kind of like chessboard moving, things like that. But it's always based on different data sets. So the idea is also to blur these lines between like health and sick or ill or normal and abnormal. Yeah.
Fabulous, fabulous. Very much at the intersection, very much a research-based project at this point.
Yeah. I mean, it will be released in an edited volume by the Max Planck Society. Yeah. So they also got interested in this intersection.
And my final question to you is, what about books? How books are so important to you? You have your dissertation about the artist's book. You have this is good. This is going to be released in a book. You've published other books. What is this?
Yeah, I guess I'm just bibliophile somehow. I mean, I'm just a book person. I guess I can never get away from the book, but at the moment it feels especially strange because I realize books become more some kind of fetish object, so we don't use them that much anymore to acquire knowledge because they are so heavy. It's like so hard to carry so many books around. So when we look at books, we want to touch special paper or look at beautiful prints. So our relationship to books as kind of containers for knowledge is radically changing somehow. But I guess it was I was a lot in the library as a child, and I always felt there is something special about this medium. And books have influenced our culture extremely. And I think a big difference in terms of like information culture, for example, if you want to compare books and new technologies, is that, of course, there were also like a lot of commercial interests behind book publishing and all of that. It was not like a purely democratic space. But when we look at our devices, our technological devices, we are so tied into that. And the way we access information is so much curated. And with books, we have a much higher chance of finding knowledge in a unusual way. And I think that's a special thing about books. But even in one book itself, I'm much more active, I'm much more involved when I'm interacting with a book than if I'm interacting with a phone. At the same time, media is changing and we will use more and more new technologies to acquire knowledge. But I think the book is something that's very essential, or has been very essential for our culture for a very long time. And it has also its impact on new technologies. If you look at a PDF or a website, I mean, this is all influenced by book culture.
Well, and there's also, we live in an era where things are so shortened down, knowledge is so shortened down, whether it's shortened down to a Wikipedia article or a summary that the AI is going to give you, or a meme even. But often when you're reading even a classic book, often it's those little scenes, those little points of departure that may not even be part of the main point, a little thrown off sentence or the like, or sometimes great points of discovery.
Yeah, and also one more thing, like my works are very often composed as chapters. So the VR work has 7 chapters, the augmented reality work has 3 chapters. With Ordnungswut, I'm not really sure, but it might also continue or like the work itself, like I see it's always kind of different modules, chapters that come together. So it's rhizomatic, but at the same time there is also enough like linear to like follow it somehow.
Well, one of the things I love about working with Marlene is that her work builds, and every year there's a new level of this knowledge kind of growing almost like you're building your own encyclopedia.
Yeah.
That's this knowledge that keeps growing in this way.
Yeah. I mean, I call myself like artistically researching encyclopedias in my thesis, so that's my research position.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, we have someone who's an encyclopedist here. Do we have any questions from the audience? Anyone with any questions about anything? I have a question for you. What influence you're living in Berlin? You're working with the sciences. Where is this idea of the? Do you have a sense of where this kind of sense of radicality could be in your work, since it's so?
I mean, I think things can be radical in lots of different ways. I mean, I think what we need at the moment is not just like something radical, but I'm thinking more about, like, for example, like soft power with this, which is embedded into arts, and making use of that and rediscovering that we have, that art has this special soft power. And I think there can be like a beautiful radical element within that soft power. So that's more kind of like, I would say that's more what I'm looking for, or how I'm feeling about it. Because radicality itself, it might create some like strong reaction or anything, but I feel what we really need at the moment, also with lots of like problematic political developments, is more understanding and sensitivity than even more radicality.
So, soft power, I love that. Yeah. I love that. Well, with soft power, I want to thank you for coming here today, and thank our audience for being here today. And thank you. So, all right, Marlene, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.